indicated. Please consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. The room layout has been adjusted to increase the distance between microphones and reduce the chance of feedback from an ambient earpiece. These measures are in place so that we can conduct our business without interruption and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including interpreters. Thank you all for your cooperation. Zoom reminders, please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Additionally, screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted. For main estimates 2024-25, I would now like to welcome our witnesses with us today for the first hour. Appearing, the Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson, Minister of Energy and Natural Resources. And we have several senior officials from the Department of Natural Resources: Michael Vandergrift, Deputy Minister; Francis Bryson, Assistant Deputy Minister and Chief Financial Officers; and other senior officials. We have the Minister for an hour, so Minister Wilkinson, the floor is yours for 5 minutes. But before you begin, I will be using these two cards, 30-second warning. Red means time's up. Mr. Wilkinson, the floor is yours.
Chair, je voudrais reconnaître que nous
I would like to acknowledge that we are gathering on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people.
Je suis très heureux d'être ici aujourd'hui.
Honorable colleagues, I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the main estimates. We are talking a lot these days about climate change for obvious reasons. Our natural environment is altered because of many reasons, and we saw this across Canada this year after the worst wildfire season in our history.
Severe act and impact on our economy and our environment. Climate change is also rapidly transforming the global economy and global finance in ways that are creating enormous economic opportunity for those who approach the transition to a low-carbon future in a thoughtful, determined, and focused manner. In order to seize the extraordinary opportunities created by the shift to a net zero economy, we must, however, accept the scientific reality of climate change and ensure that this informs and shapes Canada's economic strategy. The strategy this government has developed includes seizing key economic opportunity in accelerating sectors, including critical minerals and the EV supply chain, hydrogen, biofuels, nuclear technology, and carbon management. It includes having a thoughtful approach to ensuring the competitiveness of Canada's oil and gas sector in what will eventually be a declining global market for these products. It includes building affordable, reliable, and clean electricity networks that will give Canada a major competitive advantage, and it involves furthering economic reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. This plan is well underway. In just the last 3 years, more than $50 billion has been announced in almost 100 clean growth projects across this country. Such projects include Honda's $15 billion investment in Ontario, Dow's approximately $10 billion net zero petrochemical facility in Alberta, Everwind and World Energy's planned hydrogen facilities in Atlantic Canada, Rio Tinto's critical mineral production facility in Sorel-Tracy, Quebec, and eMolly One's $1 billion battery facility in Maple Ridge, British Columbia. Certainly, this focus on building a clean economy for the future was reflected in the recent budget. Budget 2024 delivered significant clean economy investments, including the EV supply chain tax credit, new measures for biofuels, the biofuel sector, and $800 million to stand up the Canada Greener Homes Affordability Program. Budget 2024 also delivered a $5 billion Indigenous loan guarantee program, which will ensure that Indigenous communities will derive long-term benefits from key energy and resource projects. Le budget principal des dépenses met également.
The main estimates also reflect a focus on creating jobs and economic opportunity in every province and territory in Canada. In the estimates, my department is seeking an increase in authorities from nearly $5.1 billion to approximately $5.55 billion.
This year's main estimates include the Oil to Heat Pump Affordability Program, the Deep Retrofit Accelerator, critical minerals development, and the implementation of Canada's National Adaptation Strategy, including wildfire resilience. The estimates include investments that are part of the government's plan to create sustainable jobs for Canadians. Having a comprehensive plan to address climate change and to seize the economic opportunities that will be enabled through the energy transition is critically important environmentally and economically. But I would say a recognition of the importance of such a plan is not shared by all leaders at the federal level. Mr. Poilievre, in particular, is fond of using the slogan, "Technology, not taxes," as a description of a plan. But this is just a tagline. It is not a strategy. It is not a plan. He opposes investment tax credits, including hydrogen, electricity, carbon management, and manufacturing. He opposes the Strategic Innovation Fund. He opposes the Canada Infrastructure Bank. He opposes the Canada Growth Fund. He opposes the Clean Fuels Regulation, and he opposes carbon pricing. As a former clean tech CEO, I can say very confidently that while technology is clearly important, technology on its own will not drive billions of dollars in new investments, nor bring new opportunities to countless communities. Technologies on its own will not allow us to successfully address the challenge of climate change. To do this, we must put into place the conditions that will enable technology development, enable demonstration, and ultimately enable commercial deployment. Unfortunately, Mr. Poilievre's plan is to simply let the planet burn and to eliminate jobs and impair Canadian competitiveness as the rest of the world moves to a low-carbon future. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not responsible leadership. And with that, I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Minister Wilkinson, for your opening remarks. We'll now proceed to our first round of questioning for 6 minutes. I will begin with Ms. Stubbs. Ms. Stubbs, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Minister, for being here today, and to all of your officials who are present and who will be taking questions after your appearance. While the radical extremist environment minister quoted an anti-energy activist group called Environmental Defence in the House of Commons about emissions reductions in Canada, I'm just going to focus on your government's actual federal national inventory report on emissions and ask you some questions about whether or not the carbon tax is actually worth the cost, since it is not reducing Canada's emissions to date. The fact is, of course, Canada has missed every single one of your government's emissions reductions targets, despite your increase of the carbon tax every year since you've implemented it. And Canadians know that emissions have increased each one of those years, except for during 2020, when governments locked Canadians down and the economy was severely damaged by those restrictions. In 2021, you said 2019 would be the last year of emissions increases in Canada, but just last week, your federal government's national inventory reported that Canada's emissions in 2022 were up from 698 million tonnes in 2021 and 686 million tonnes in 2020. During 2022, they were at 708 million tonnes. So will you just simply admit that your carbon tax is not worth the cost and it's failed to reduce Canada's emissions?
Thank you for the question. I would say a few things to that. I mean, the first is I know that folks on the Conservative side of the House often talk about missing targets, but the only target this government has ever had was the 30% below 2005 levels that we inherited from Prime Minister Harper. That's a 2030 target. We actually have made it more ambitious, so it's 40 to 45%, and there's a milestone that we actually implemented in the Act that went through Parliament that is a 2026 number, and we are fully on track to meet that. So we are on track to meet the targets that we actually have established. In terms of the National Inventory Report, what it shows is Canada actually has reduced emissions by 8% versus the 2005 level. It is on track to achieve the targets for 2030, so we are making good progress on the way there. And it also shows that actually 24 of those megatons in 2030, 79 or 78 of the megatons actually come from the carbon price. So it's almost a third of the reductions come from the carbon price.
Minister, you can forgive Canadians for not being compelled by your comparison to a number in 2005. You've been in government for 9 years, so let's just talk about what your claims have been, what your policies are, and what the outcomes have been. What your policy has been was to spike the carbon tax by 25% on April 1st, despite 8 premiers asking you not to, and despite more Canadians unable to feed themselves, house themselves, heat and cool themselves when they're needed. Your response has been your Liberal senators holding up Conservative Bill C-234 that would provide carbon tax exemptions on farmers and farm fuels at exactly a time when Canadian farmers are struggling to be able to produce food
point of order,
and
Mr.
Canadians
Chair.
can't afford to eat.
Ms. Stubbs, can I just pause that thought right there? We have a point of order from Mr. Bruson. Mr. Bruson on the point of order.
I appreciate everything that the member opposite, Ms. Stubbs, is raising, except for we're speaking with the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources. It's about natural resources, and she's definitely focusing more on what if the Minister of Environment might be there for.
Point of order.
Wondering if she would be
Point of order.
switching to talking about energy and natural resources in the main estimates.
Point of order.
We have another point of order, Mr. Bruson. Colleagues, on your point of order, Mr. Patzer on the point of order.
Well, yeah. I mean, all that this committee has talked about for the last number of years is anything that has to do with the environment, not actually to do with developing natural resources. And given the hyper-partisan speech that was given by the minister to kick things off here, my colleague is definitely well within her rights to say what it is that she is saying as a member.
Okay, so I have several points of order, and I have Mr. Angus on a point of order, so I'll go to you next. But I had asked colleagues not to use the point of orders for debate, and you can use your intervention for debate. But I will go to you, Mr. Angus, on a point of order.
Yes, on the same point of order. I think that opposition members need to be able to ask a question to the minister. They shouldn't have government members running interference and trying to break up the flow of the questions. If the questions are fair, if they're not abusive, it's the right of the MP to ask what questions they want of a minister.
Thank you. I think I've exhausted the point of order. So, colleagues, I'll say, as to the original point of order, please ask your questions to the minister and try to keep it relevant to the conversation today on the main estimates and the questions the minister can ask that are related to his portfolio. And so thank you for your point of order, Mr. Bruson, and other colleagues who have provided a point of order as well. I'm going to go back to you, Ms. Stubbs, and we did stop your time. We will begin from where we had paused. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, colleagues. And certainly, when the government uses revenue from Canadians from the carbon tax in the budget, and Canadians can't actually see the direct line between the cash grab that the government takes through the carbon tax to innovation or technology or new sources of energy. And in fact, the outcome of this government is anti-resource development, anti-energy, and holding Canada back from being able to provide the products and the technologies for our own self-sufficiency and for our allies around the world. Questions about the carbon tax, its revenue, and whether or not it's worth the cost are certainly relevant. So thanks, Chair, and thank you for the interventions from the other opposition. So, Minister, the reality is that the carbon tax is at $80 a ton right now. Your plan is to hike it to $170 a ton by 2030, in less than 6 years. I think it's really important for Canadians to know that that's your plan, given the affordability crisis that Canadians face right now due to your inflationary spending that has also hiked interest rates, and to all of the taxes and added costs that you are putting on resource developers, on farmers, and on all kinds of industrial development, which dampens the economy and also increases the price of goods of every single thing for every Canadian, just as the carbon tax was designed to do. So your plan is to double the carbon tax in less than 6 years. Will that stop the forest and wildfires that you mentioned at the beginning of your remarks?
Let me start with the
How high
comment
does
you
it
said
have
at
to
the
go?
beginning, which is why use 2005? 2005 is the base year that the Paris Agreement uses, so every country around the world uses it, but we have seen significant reductions since 2015 as well. In terms of the carbon price, and we've had this discussion in the House of Commons many times, but 8 out of 10 families actually get more money back. It works directly inverse to income, so actually people who live on the most modest incomes get the most money back. That is something that more than 300 economists have weighed in on, including Trevor Toombs from the University of Calgary, including Brent Dolter from the University of Regina. It is an affordability mechanism, but it is also effective in addressing the climate crisis. It, in 2030, will be about half of the emissions reduction, so will it address address the impacts of climate change? Yes, over time it will. Just as deploying electric vehicles, deploying carbon capture and sequestration, improving energy efficiency, all will have an impact on reducing the impacts of climate change.
Thank you, Ms. Stubbs. Time is up, and thank you, Minister Wilkinson. We'll now go to Mr. Aldag for the next 6 minutes.
Well, Minister, thank you for being here, and thank you for having your officials here. I see lots of familiar faces, and it's always good to see your group here and able to speak with us. Minister, as a British Columbian Member of Parliament yourself, I know that you and I and our province are very concerned about forest fires. And so my first question is going to be along those lines. We know that last year, communities across British Columbia were evacuated as we witnessed devastating wildfires, and not just in the interior of the north, but even into the lower mainland, places where we've not historically seen them, and on Vancouver Island. It was the worst and most costly wildfire season on record. Canada did a lot to ensure British Columbians were safe then, as did Canada's brave first responders and firefighters. But we're looking at another horrible fire season to come. Every indication is that we're on track to have a lot more of our forests burn in the coming summer. So I'd like if you could take a moment to talk to us about the work that you've done to prepare for this upcoming wildfire season, and as well the work that you've done to support firefighters, those who brave men and women who risk their lives to save the resources and habitats that are so important for biodiversity in our province.
Thank you, Mr. Aldag. So yes, forest fires were a terrible issue last year, and unfortunately, these are the kinds of things that we are going to see with increased frequency moving forward because of the impacts of climate change. And certainly this summer, the prospects look very challenging in many parts of the country. The Government of Canada certainly acted last year. We have made significant investments in equipment for the provinces and territories to purchase additional firefighting equipment. There's over $250 million that was actually flown through there. We set aside significant funds to actually train additional wildland firefighters, and a lot of those on Indigenous communities, which obviously are often very much at risk. They live in areas that often are prone to forest fires. But we also started a pilot with the International Association of Firefighters, which was really about how do you actually help get municipal firefighters to help in that interface between community and forest. And many of those exist in British Columbia as well as in other provinces in this country. Certainly in my riding of North Vancouver, we're right up against the forest in the mountains. And so we provided some money to help them train their firefighters on how to do that. We just actually augmented that a couple of weeks ago with additional funds. Certainly, we are working very much with the provinces and territories, both directly on these funding arrangements, but also through what's called CIFC, which is basically coordinates the resources across provinces so that if Nova Scotia doesn't have a bad firefighting year, they can actually help deploy people and equipment to Alberta or British Columbia if they do have one. And so certainly a lot of work going on there, not just with NRCan, but also with the Minister of Emergency Preparedness, Minister Sajjan.
Thank you for that response and the update. I think it'll bring some relief to British Columbians knowing that we are working with the provincial government and other organizations, First Nations and others to prepare for this upcoming fire season. Staying with the British Columbia theme, I'd also like to talk about a recent announcement and investment in Maple Ridge. And this was the E1 Molly investment. Being out in the Fraser Valley, this is a couple of ridings away from mine. It's a very important investment to help bring good jobs to our part of the Lower Mainland. And so I'd welcome your comments that you could share about your work in supporting and growing the economy of British Columbia through investments such as this. And if you could also speak to how the Government of Canada continues to attract these kind of investments, not only to British Columbia, but to Canada.
Yeah, I mean, so look, I said in the opening that having a thoughtful and ultimately successful plan for the economy means actually agreeing and accepting the reality of climate change and building an economic plan that actually accommodates that and thinks about the opportunities that are going to be created in the context of a move towards a low-carbon future. Canada has perhaps the most comprehensive climate plan that exists anywhere in the world, and we certainly have been working to have beside it the economic plan that looks to seize those opportunities moving forward. One of those that I mentioned was the eMolly 1 plant, which is a $1 billion battery investment in Maple Ridge, BC, which is going to create significant numbers years of jobs and economic opportunity in BC. But it's also the Air Products hydrogen facility in Alberta. It's the BHP potash mine, Jansen potash mine in Saskatchewan. It's a whole range of battery and electric vehicle announcements in Ontario and Quebec. It's the hydrogen work that's happening in Nova Scotia and in Newfoundland and Labrador, and the enormous sort of growth in renewable energy, particularly wind, in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So we are seeing a whole range of activities that are moving forward that are actually catalyzing economic growth, and that exists in every province and territory in this country.
Great, thank you. It looks like I have about a minute left, so I'll try to get to the point. We've seen both this committee and in the House the conservative rhymes and slogans that are really a demonstration of the rejection of climate science and frankly, opposition to renewable energy. And we experienced that firsthand here at this committee. We saw the attempts to block offshore wind for Atlantic Canada's, blocking workers from getting a seat at the table. And yet the global energy transition is well underway. It is going to move ahead whether Canada is on board or not. And so if you could take the last bit of time that we have to elaborate on the indicators that show that this is happening and what Canada should do about it.
It is happening all over the world, and the International Energy Agency tracks this very well and talks about the fact that this actually is not a question of if, it's a question of how fast. But look, I mean, in 2020, 1 in 25 vehicles sold globally were zero-emission vehicles. Last year, it was 1 in 5. Enormous progress. We are seeing the share of fossil fuels in electricity generation fall dramatically, and it will continue to fall dramatically by 2030. Almost half of the world's electricity supply will come from renewables, and 80% by 2030, and 80% of all new electricity capacity between now and 2030 will be renewables. 50% of new U.S. car registrations are going to be electric. Heat pumps are actually overtaking fossil fuel boilers. We are seeing all kinds of progress that is happening. And the best example, to be honest with you, we're seeing it in Europe, we're seeing it in Japan, we're seeing it in South Korea, we're seeing it in the United States. But China's been very strategic, and we need to be thoughtful about how we respond to this. So China actually now is the #1 manufacturer and 1 or 2 manufacturer of electric vehicles, and the #1 deployer, the #1 developer of renewable energy technologies, and the #1 deployer. They control much of the critical minerals and critical minerals processing capacity around the world. That is very strategic because they have made an enormous bet on the energy transition. Everywhere around the world, this is happening, and Canada needs to be part of that conversation.
Thank you, Minister Wilkinson. Time's up. I'll now go to Monsieur Simard for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Minister. A while ago, in your opening statement, you indicated that we have to accept the scientific reality of climate change. On that note, I agree with you. The scientific reality of climate change has indicated that one of the main things that are responsible for this is the oil and gas sector. Over the past 4 years, your government has given this sector about $65 billion in financial support. For 2023, we're talking about $18 billion. If I look at the budget, what I see by 2035, there are tax credits and other grants that could go up to 83 billion support granted to this sector. Of course, there's also what was given to Trans Mountain last week, which will add 890,000 barrels. So this is a project that had to initially cost $7.3 million. Is estimated to cost more. I have a simple question for you. If we had to redo Trans Mountain all over again, do you think you will do the same thing? Yes, we have a plan to fight climate change, but of course, we need an energy transition plan. This is not something that will happen overnight. And of course, we need access to the resources that we're using now and over the next 20 to 30 years. But of course, the Trans Mountain project is important to ensure that Canada enjoys a fair price for its resources. Of course, we need a plan to accelerate the transition. We need a plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the oil sector and in all sectors of the economy. And that is what we've done with the ceiling on emissions, with the regulations on methane and other things as well. Question, I would like to hear you say more about that because we studied that here in committee. the ceiling on emissions, but we never talked about having a ceiling on production. Talking about reducing the carbon footprint of the oil sector by increasing their capacity to produce. How is this logical? Because this oil will be burnt eventually. It will be generated. It will generate greenhouse gas emissions. In 2023, your government was supposed to come with a definition of what was an efficient support, and put an end to the support to this sector. That does not happen. And now you also have generous tax credits that you're giving. Do you not believe that you are being complacent with the oil sector? Answer. As I said, we were the first in the world to end inefficient subsidies to this sector, the only country in the world that has done that. The others will do it by 2025, not now. Of course, we need to take measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions produced by the oil sector. And that is something that should happen in all sectors of the economy. We need a plan that is consistent with our targets. And as I've already said, we are consistent with our 2030 targets. Question, let me bring you back to nuclear energy. Over the past few months, there was a form of reduction in the regulation for nuclear waste. And we learned that some wastewater was thrown into Chalk River. Unfortunately, we are not able to identify the contaminants that were thrown there and the quantity. And this is disturbing in a context where we want to reduce accountability when it comes to nuclear waste. And in the Ottawa, we have a great source of potable water for people in the region. Is this concerning? Shouldn't we be able to at least identify the contaminants that were thrown there? Answer, yes. There's a team and experts that are looking into that. But no radioactive nuclear contaminants were thrown there, only wastewater. Of course, the Department of Environment has to investigate the situation and discuss with Chalk River. But if there's wastewater thrown there, that means that the measures in place to make sure that there are no problems in Chalk River, clearly there were problems. How can we now trust the measures in place in a context where you want to declassify some nuclear waste? Many stakeholders came and told us that everything is done with very little consultation. Don't you believe that the situation should be reviewed when it comes to nuclear waste? Answer. The issue of wastewater has existed. Not only it doesn't exist only in that facility. It exists in all municipalities throughout the country. It is something that we need to manage all the time, and it's important. We need to investigate the situation to find out what is going on. Question, and on the declassification on some nuclear waste that will go from from average intensity to low intensity.
For your next round. Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Angus for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looking at the latest greenhouse gas emission numbers, we see that once again, the oil and gas sector continues to rise. So it could be argued that other sectors are doing their part, but the oil and gas sector continues to rise. So given the fact that your government spent $34 billion building a pipeline when there was no economic case, and we're looking at an increase of production from 300,000 barrels a day to 900,000 barrels a day, how much emissions are you factoring in from the
Angus,
increase?
My apologies. I'm going to ask you to hold that thought. We have bells ringing, and I do need unanimous consent to continue. Do we have finished this round? Yeah. Is that fine? Finish this round? Okay. So we'll finish this round, and then we'll proceed to the...
So can I start?
Go.
I'm just trying for a little bit of fairness here, just a little
You were cut off mid-sentence in your first 15 seconds, so go ahead.
Okay. We're looking at the latest greenhouse gas emissions, and yet again, oil and gas continues to increase. And the government's told us all these promises about decreasing oil and gas emissions, and yet it's not happening. So now you spent $34 billion of public money building a pipeline for which there was no case in the private sector. That will increase production from 300,000 to 900,000 barrels a day. So how much more emissions are you looking at being added to the annual toll coming from the oil and gas sector?
Well, let me start just by correcting one thing you said. It's not an increase in production of 300 to 800,000. It's an increase in pipeline capacity. There is significant oil that has been moving by rail that now will move in the pipeline, and so that is not increased production. But certainly all of the. Can you let me finish my answer?
All right, go ahead.
So all of the increases that are expected in production are factored into the forecast going forward in terms of emissions from the oil and gas sector. But Mr. Angus, I would agree with the beginning of your comment, which is we do need to see reductions in absolute emissions coming from the oil and gas sector. It is certainly time that we saw the Pathways folks and others put their money where their mouth is.
They're putting our money where their mouth is, and you're giving it to them. Mr. Wilkinson, I have enormous respect for you, but I've heard this line from your government for 9 years that we can drink our way to sobriety. And, just give us a few more drinks and they're going to get better. For you to say that, don't worry, we're going to build this extra pipeline, but it's not going to rapidly increase production is ridiculous. Because we've seen Imperial announcing massive increases in the final quarter of last year, saying they're going to really ramp up production of Curl Lake because of TMX. So are you trying to tell us that, don't worry, this is just going to take stuff off the train and it's not going to have a massive increase? Or are you telling us that the emissions that are going to come out of this increase somehow are going to be clean?
What I'm saying to you is that it is important that we actually see emissions go down in the oil and gas sector. That is why we have put into place regulations with respect to methane, and we are enhancing those going forward. It is why we are putting a cap on oil and gas emissions across the country, the only country in the world to do that. And that is about ensuring that the oil and gas sector plays a role in reducing emissions across this country.
So we're going to put a cap on while we're vastly increasing export capacity of the highest GHG emission causing.
We are going to ensure that the oil and gas sector makes its contribution to Canada's emissions reduction plan, just like the auto sector, just like the cement, just like everyone else.
So the issue was it's $34 billion of public money. There was no private sector case. The International Energy Agency has warned against governments investing in oil infrastructure because of stranded assets. There was no case. So you built them a pipeline. But what we've been told from the energy regulator and from analysis is that it would be too expensive to run through. The toll fees would be too high to pay off the cost. So those toll fees have been capped at 22%, meaning that the public is going to pick up 78% of every barrel going through the pipeline. So will you guarantee us that the public is not going to pay a dime, that all the money that the public paid to the Pathways Alliance is going to be paid back barrel by barrel by barrel?
Well, I would say, first of all, the Government of Canada only bought the pipeline because of the obstruction of the NDP government in British Columbia. And certainly one of the loudest cheerleaders in terms of the Government of Canada taking that on was the NDP Premier of Alberta. At the end of the day, the pipeline cost more than we expected it to cost at the beginning, but we still believe very strongly that there is great value in the pipeline and that we, as the Prime Minister of Finance has said, expect that we are going to be able to get our money back.
I would love to think that the NDP government in BC had such a big influence on you, but you bought that pipeline because there was no private sector case and you were doing a favor for Pathways Alliance, companies that have never, ever shown any initiative to lower emissions. There's no record of them doing that, and yet we're on the hook for $34 billion. So to go back to my question, the toll fees have been capped at 22% because this boondoggle can't pay for itself. That means we are on the hook for covering off the cost of every barrel shipped by Imperial or any of the other companies. So how are we going to be guaranteed that we're not subsidizing to 78% per barrel for every barrel that's shipped down that pipeline?
Well, I would say, Mr. Angus, that I have great respect for you as well, but you're just wrong about that. When Minister Heyman in British Columbia and the Premier of British Columbia said they would use all tools in the toolbox to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline, that created such uncertainty that it made it very, very difficult for a private sector entity to proceed with it.
But
I
you're
would
not
say
answering
that
the question.
the
You're
value
trying
of
to
the
pick a
Trans
fight
Mountain
about the
Pipeline,
BC
both for
NDP.
the companies
Will we have to pay
in
for it?
Alberta and for the Canadian public, remains strong.
Will we have to pay? I don't know anybody in the BC NDP. I got to tell you, except in my own caucus, and I'm sure they play a huge role in this. But you're avoiding the question. We paid $34 billion of public money for a project that had no business case, and now to make it pay back, it has to be paid back through the toll fees. So are we going to be on the hook for the toll fees for every single barrel that goes through there? Because the CER says we're going to be paying 78% per barrel of the cost. Yes or no?
That's actually not what the CR said. But the Government of Canada doesn't intend to be the long-term owner of the pipeline. We do intend to sell it, and we believe that we will recoup the money that the Government of Canada has invested in the pipeline.
So are we going to sell it for
Thank
$34
you.
billion, or are you going to give it away?
Mr. Angus.
Thank you.
And Minister Wilkinson, thank you for your round of questioning. Colleagues, I propose, as bells are ringing, we have about 23 minutes, one round, a shortened round, and we can go with a 4-4-2-2 or a 5-5-2.5. I just want to give colleagues enough time. 5-5-2.5 gives us 15 minutes, which gives you 7 minutes to sort of vote. Are we good with that, or would a shorter, a 4-4-2-2? Okay, well, if we have unanimous consent for 4-4-2-2, and I know our colleague, Mr. Maurice, at the end of that 4-4-2-2 would like to ask a question as well. Do we have unanimous consent to allow him to ask a question at the end of all questions? I see consent, so we'll go 4-4-2-2 and one question for Mr. Maurice to finish. Okay, so let's go. Our next round. Oops, I turned off my mic. Our next round is a 4-minute round, and we will go to Ms. Stubbs for 4 minutes. Go ahead. The floor is yours, Ms. Stubbs.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Minister. Again, I just wonder, Minister, can you tell Canadians how much carbon Canada sequesters annually?
Sorry, how much?
Carbon Canada sequesters annually.
Carbon Canada sequesters annually. I don't know, Michael.
It seems like if a government's trying to achieve net zero emissions performance, then what should be known as how much Canada sequesters carbon on an annual basis, say through
forest sequestration
and tree planting.
You're talking about forest sequestration.
Well, there's a variety of ways that carbon can be sequestered.
Yeah,
so
wetlands, grasslands, trees. Certainly the 2 billion trees program has a number with respect to that particular program, but in terms of the overall sequestration, I don't know, Glenn, if you have a number, but we can certainly get back to you on that. Environment Canada would have that number.
Okay. It seems like Natural Resources Minister also talking about tree planting and also being a big proponent of these policies would know that number, because it seems very material to whether or not the government really has a definition of what it's trying to achieve when you're moving towards net zero emissions. But to your point, you're right that tree planting is an extremely effective way to enhance biodiversity, to sequester carbon, and to facilitate better wildlife management and sustainability. So I noticed in the estimates that you've increased the budget for the 2 billion tree planting by 2031 promise from $282.5 million in 2023-24 to $338 million in 2024-25. As of June 30th, 2023, the 2 billion trees program has agreements signed to only plant 374 million trees by 2031. That's less than 19% of this stated goal. And as of September 25th, 2023, your department, NRCan, reported that only 56 million trees have been planted, which is less than 3% of this stated goal. Can you tell Canadians how you actually expect to reach that goal in the next 7 years if you're only 3% towards the goal 3 years in and have only signed agreements for a mere 19% of trees?
Thank you. It's a good question. So let me start by just saying that in terms of sequestration, under the Paris Agreement, what actually countries track are anthropogenic emissions, both positive and negative. So it's human-caused emissions, or human interventions to actually reduce through sequestration or direct air capture or anything else. In terms of the 2 billion tree program, we now have agreements that are either signed or are very close to being signed with about 550 million trees, which is a significant movement since the numbers that you quoted. We actually feel very good about that. The first couple of years of that program, obviously, we're going to be slower because you had to actually grow the seedlings, but we're making good progress and we feel that we're on track.
Thanks, Chair. The Chair tells me I have about a minute left. I know that there are real challenges with the survivability of seedlings, which are not being bred and distributed properly according to their hardiness zones across the many diverse regions in Canada. Can you tell Canadians why it appears your government is padding the numbers on your tree planting promise, given that the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development says that NR Canada is using trees planted under a different program and a different department to boost its numbers?
So I guess two things. I mean, the first is there is always some attrition with respect to seedlings, but we have factored that into our calculations. One of the things the Commissioner said, which we agree with, is we need a more robust monitoring program to ensure that we're actually tracking the trees and how they do once they're actually in the ground, and that's something that we have been working on, and you will probably hear more about that in the coming months. In terms of the Commissioner, we were very clear from the very beginning that the 2 billion tree commitment actually included funding from a number of different programs, including the Low Carbon Economy Fund. The bulk come from the 2 billion tree fund, but some come from others, and so it's a relatively modest amount of trees, but some do come from the Low Carbon Economy Fund.
Thank you, Minister Wilkinson. We'll go to our next round of 4 minutes for Ms. Jones. Ms. Jones, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for appearing today. There's been a tremendous support towards our critical mineral strategy in Canada, and I hear it all the time from the mining industry in particular. Can you explain to us what the role of the Critical Minerals Infrastructure Fund is and how we are using it to support community development and economic development at the same time in many regions across Canada?
Sure, it's a great question. I mean, critical minerals obviously are the building blocks for decarbonization of the transportation sector. You need them to build the batteries, and you need those to build the electric vehicle plants, but they're also critical for photovoltaics and for wind turbines and a range of other things. It is important that we accelerate the work to develop new mines. It is also important that we are investing in the development of processing technologies so that the world is not so dependent on China. And part of the critical mineral strategy was $1.5 billion in the Critical Minerals Infrastructure Fund, which is intended to support things like transmission lines and roads into areas, regions where you could actually foresee the development of multiple different mines. To ensure that you're actually enabling the rapid development of these facilities. Certainly, as folks know, most of these mines exist in rural and remote areas. They create jobs and economic opportunity for people who actually live in some of these communities, and certainly for many of the First Nations that live in these areas. So it is a real important economic opportunity that will really dramatically impact rural and remote areas.
Well, in my riding of Labrador, I know how important critical minerals are and how important the mining industry is to the local economy and to jobs for people. And of course, I'm just back from the Arctic where the situation is very similar. But there are also regions of the country where we have large Indigenous populations, and they have wanted to be a partner in what's happening in their lands and in their regions. Can you tell us about the new Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program and how that will support Indigenous communities when it comes to resource development and other forms of development?
Yeah, I mean, this is an announcement that I was particularly happy to make or to see make. This is an Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program that will enable Indigenous communities to be economic participants in many of the projects that take place on their traditional territories. This is important as a matter of social justice, but it is also important in the context of aligning interests, so that there is a strong economic interest for communities, that they see long-term benefits flowing back that will enable them to actually be thoughtful and about making choices for themselves. And so this is an enormously important thing. I would, say a number of Indigenous leaders were involved, but most importantly, I think leading that was the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. It is an enormously important piece of work for the country in terms of economic reconciliation and enhancing and accelerating the energy transition.
Do I have some more time? Okay. I'll try and make it very quick. In terms of the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program, obviously there's a lot of enthusiasm out there from Indigenous governments, in terms of how they can access the program. And is there any specific criteria or demands that they will have to meet in terms of trying to get over this threshold? I think that's where the big concern is for some of them.
Yeah, and so a lot of the details on this still need to be fully sorted out, and there is an opportunity for folks to weigh in with the thoughts that they have. What we did say is it will be sector agnostic, so it will apply to all sectors in the resource space. But we will be looking to ensure that there are a portfolio of different project types and regional representation, so that, for example, people who live in northeastern British Columbia or in your riding, where the opportunity is really only mining, that there is going to be some representation of mining as well as forestry, as well as a range of other resource projects.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Wilkinson. We'll now go to Monsieur Simard for 2 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you very much. On the 2 billion trees, let me be sincere with you, Mr. Minister. There's a lot of cynicism about that. When people heard about it, it's a demonstration of the lack of support towards the federal government, the lack of support for the forestry industry. Many people have simply stopped listening to the government when they talk about that. So that's not what I want to insist on. During your statement, you talked about the worst wildfire season. And the measures you implemented have forgotten something very important. The small forestry entrepreneurs, these are some of the pillars of the sector. They could not go to the forest at the right time, and this has caused very high preparation costs. They've lost a lot of expenses. And these are small entrepreneurs. And we are trying to come up with a program to help them survive that period. Because when there are forest fires, they have to leave the forest but continue to pay for equipment, and it's very expensive. Have you thought about that when you think about fighting forest fires?
Oui, bien sûr, nous nous sommes engagés.
Yes, we are committed to providing more than $800 million to fight against wildfires and more than $350 million to renew support to the forest sector. But we are working with the government of Quebec now to address the impacts of wildfires caused by climate change. And as you know, we are collaborating with the government, and we are trying to negotiate to see how we can work together with the government of Quebec to fight the effects of climate change.
Time is up. Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Angus for 2 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair. We did a lot of work together on the issue of renewable energy, and I think we really believed in it. We have an environmental crisis, and we have an economic crisis. If we don't meet it, we lose out. Texas, in a single month, produced 50% more solar than Canada has ever produced. I mean, you don't get much more right-wing reactionary than Texas, and yet they're moving ahead as pretty much the world leader right now. And yet, in Budget 2023, $50 billion in investment tax credits announced. And then there was going to be consultations. And in 2024, we've got consultations, and they're being announced. People I'm hearing are shipping their investments to the United States because it's there, it's happening, and we're still talking about it. So I guess my frustration with TMX is that, the money didn't wait for TMX, it flowed. And yet the $50 billion that's been promised to get clean energy projects off the ground, we're still talking about it. Why the delay?
So certainly I am very keen to see those finalized and out the door such that they will catalyze even more investment, although I would say many organizations are not waiting for the final form. Most of the details are actually a matter of public record. If you look at, for example, the Dow Chemical net zero petrochemical facility, that was enabled by the ITCs. But I share your view that we need to actually get this done quickly, and I think the budget spoke to the dates by which you can expect to see those.
Thank you. I'm fine. I give my 20 seconds to Mr. Morris.
All right, Mr. Morris, to wrap it up for today, you have one question.
Wonderful. Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Mr. Angus and colleagues. Minister, as you know, I'm quite concerned about the lack of funds for the Greener Home Grant program. This is a fund that had $2.6 billion over 7 years. Nothing like what we gave to TMX. We gave that $34 billion. Carbon capture got $5.7 billion, but it was so successful, homeowners getting $5,000 each to incentivize retrofits, that it was spent more quickly than I think your department was expecting. As of February 9th, Ontarians no longer have access to this at all. The budget comes out after we'd written you letters about this and you'd heard from Canadians about it, and it actually got reduced. It's down to $160 million a year over the course of 5 years. I know there are other programs, and these are important complementary initiatives, but I just do not understand the thinking behind reducing the Greener Home Grant program. Can you explain more the thinking about this?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So the program, as you say, was very successful. It actually expended its funds more quickly than we had anticipated. And in that regard, it incented people to actually make energy efficiency retrofits, which were obviously very positive in terms of the fight against climate change. But when we looked at the program by and large was being used by people who were in the upper middle and upper income brackets, because it actually was only $5,000, which meant that people who actually needed the money the most probably couldn't afford the remainder of the money that would be required. It required that you put the money up and then you got it paid back over time. And so, again, it made it difficult for people who live on more modest means to access it. And so what we made the decision to do was to focus on a new program that would really be focused on people who live on more modest incomes with larger grants that would be paid up front, that would probably be delivered through provincial agencies, and that we would use the other program, which is the zero interest loan program, which provides a financial benefit for people who can actually afford to pay the loan back over time out of the energy savings.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Wilkinson. Thank you for your testimony today. That concludes this portion of the meeting. Colleagues, we do have a vote, so we will now suspend, and we'll come back for our second hour with officials. And thank you for officials for joining as well today. We are now suspended.